Good morning to all. My name is Frank Reedy, and I'm representing the Strategic Studies Department here at JSOU. Today, we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker, including audience Q&A. The session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, policy, or opinions of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or JSOU. If you have questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@socom.mil. Since unsettled weather is always a possibility, if you lose connection, just rejoin the session. If the internet fails you, you can always dial in with the phone numbers on your registration email. Today's moderator is Mr. Jack Guy, one of the most experienced faculty members here at JSOU. He will introduce the program and today's guest.
Thank you, Frank. Good afternoon. My name is Jack Guy, and I'm an adjunct instructor at the Joint Special Operations University located in Tampa, Florida. I want to welcome everyone to another online interview of Think JSOU. Think JSOU is an ongoing series that explores research and publications of the JSOU faculty, of resident senior fellows, leading academics, and the wider SOF and international security community. This online connection includes interviews and conversations with authors and researchers and is intended to supplement existing publications, articles, and other active discussions. We encourage everyone to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by reviewing our online offerings on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and the All Partner Access Network, or APAN. Today, we welcome Dr. Richard Shultz, Professor of International Politics at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. He's also the director of the Fletcher School's International Security Studies program, which is dedicated to graduate level teaching and research on a broad range of conflict, defense, and strategic issues. As many of you know, Dick Shultz is no stranger to SOCOM, where he is currently working on several initiatives in the SOF arena. Today, we will be looking at his monograph published by the JSOU Press, Military Innovation in War, It Takes a Learning Organization. This, as you know, is a case study of Task Force 714 in Iraq. We will additionally be talking about his latest book, Transforming U.S. Intelligence for Irregular War, Task Force 714 in Iraq, published this year by the Georgetown Press. Dr. Shultz, thank you so very much for joining us today. This presentation is timely, and especially given our re-energized topic of great power competitions and the questions it raises about the roles of SOF in the great power competition, along with the things that SOF will need to complete its missions. I suspect this will be part of our discussion today. Let's give you a few minutes in the beginning to bring context to today's discussion before we open it up to our listeners. To the audience, you can ask questions by going to the Q&A button at the bottom of the page. We ask you to please mute your computers. And with that, Dick, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jack, and thank you for the kind introduction. I'll try to put this in context and show where it's led me most recently. As probably many listening in know, I've had a long-standing interest in SOF, going back to the 1990s. And I've been a senior fellow for quite a while with JSOU. I kind of stumbled across 714. I mean, it's always interesting how you get interested in these things. My wife's son and I were driving around Morocco, and when you're driving through the mountains, you know, after a while, I got bored, but I always pack a book. And the book I packed was My Share of the Task by Stan McChrystal. And so I started to read General McChrystal's book, and it was really the chapter on Iraq that captured my attention, and how Task Force 714, which is, you know, best in the world, had a real challenge on its hands when it entered Iraq, because it was given a mission that it could not fulfill given the way it was structured. And so I got interested in this from a research point of view by asking just two sort of simple questions. Why was 714 able to change, and how were they able to change? And what this did was it led me to construct a model or a framework that I called characteristics of learning organizations. And I used it to answer those two questions, why and how 714 was able to innovate and transform. And essentially, they faced what I call a crisis in practice. You know, what they were built to do, what they were very good at doing, was not enough. They had to transform themselves. And so I found that the way they did that was to take a highly compartmented, standalone organization and turn it into a joint interagency task force. Now, this joint interagency task force was really a joint interagency intelligence task force. And it brought into 714 all the intelligence agencies, and it just turned on its head the way they did business. And this is captured really by the way that their JSOU at the time, who was Mike Flynn, the way Mike Flynn explained the problem to General McChrystal. He said, 80% of what you're doing is operations, 20% is intelligence. You got to turn that around. 80% of what you should be doing should be intelligence, 20% operations. And then they did that, adapted that to a targeting construct that was based on this F3EA process, and they were off to the races. And the way to understand how radical this was is through some simple numbers. In August of 2004, operating at the highest rate possible, they could carry out 20 or 30 operations a month. 2 years later, August 2006, they carried out 300 operations a month. And those operations were intelligence collection vacuum cleaners. So what this meant was, and that Task Force 714 was really the first organization to face today what we call the big data challenge. They were collecting massive amounts of data that they had to have new systems to be able to manage that data, mine that data, and employ it to drive this F3EA process. And they did that. Now, what's interesting about that is that that first of all, Soft did that because they're not afraid to adapt new technologies and new ways of doing things on the fly. But that continued to inform the way the task force and its follow-on organizations in other parts of the battle space did things. And it made them consumers for the Department of Defense's first big initiative in the AI/ML arena. So, all of that, I was able to tell the story of 714 in the monograph in the book, and now most recently with General Clark, begin to peel the onion on how big data is being used by SOF in the Maven enterprise. So that's kind of an overview of this. I would say one more thing. In terms of what were the sources of transformation, I really focused on how 714 was able to learn through self-reflection, which was really important, learning from yourself. How they were able to learn because leadership facilitated learning. And then finally, how they were able to learn from the experiences of others, which is something I stumbled across in the research. So that's kind of the story in a nutshell, Jack.
Well, I thank you for that. I think as we begin the questioning and we begin a look at this, as I read through both the monograph and the book, it became apparent to me that this is really about how organizations change and how organizations allow themselves to change and recruit the people within the organization to go along with that. What do you think of these sources that you talked about? Which one do you think is the most important? Is it the leadership? Is it the ability to self-reflect? What does it really take?
Mm-hmm. I think leadership was really important, and it was really important for leadership, to think differently. And I mean, when you have leaders like General McChrystal, Admiral McRaven, General Votel, our image of them is they're out on the point, leading. But that's not what happened here. They became facilitators, and this is, I think it's really captured well in General McChrystal's book, Team of Teams, because this really took a team, and so he makes the argument that he had to become a facilitator, so that others could take action without having to check in with the boss. If you have to check in with the boss, you're not going to be able to raise the rate of your operational tempo. So I saw leadership here as very important. And, these are three amazing leaders, and there were others. I mean, these are just three that I mentioned.
Do you think the way an organization is constructed is also part of this? As you pointed to, the moving towards a JIADF kind of construct, that it required something you talked about with agency, that people all the way through the organization had to be able to respond.
Yeah. I mean, and Jack, I think that was an important part of what the leadership understood, that in order to be able to do this and raise this tempo, you really had to give agency to all of the members of the organization. Now, it was really interesting the way that McChrystal talked about his headquarters, which was this, apparently, I didn't see it, but I've seen his headquarters in Alexandria. And it's this big, wide open space, where everyone has a seat. And when they would do planning, when they would do their planning for the missions that they're going to carry out that night, you could have very junior people feel unrestrained in putting up their hand and saying, well, wait a minute, I can tell you of something about what you're going to do because of what I've been working on.
Right.
And that kind of agency, from what I understand, was absolutely important to making this JSOU work.
All right. We have a question asking if you can discuss the micro and macro relevance of big data and actionable intelligence relative to special operations.
Well, that's a big question. In the case of, let's start with 714. So 714, I said it in my opening remarks, they became an intelligence vacuum cleaner. On every raid, one of the main objectives of the raid was to collect. And they would collect all these computers and hard drives and thumb drives and telephones and so on. And now that's a massive amount of information. They needed systems that were able to take that information, condition it, and put it into a data system that allowed for immediate use. So they couldn't have, without those systems, they would not have been able to take advantage of the information they were collecting as quickly as they did. And sometimes this stuff was fed from the field. And something that would come up from the field in conditioning this that would lead you to do something in the field. Right. So that was really, really important. And so big data became an opportunity for SOF and for the task force. But they had to have the ability and the technical help to take advantage of that. Now, this is just going to grow exponentially in the future. And especially, when we think about, 714 was really looking through a soda straw, at a particular area. Now we're talking about vast areas in which we're going to have an array of collection platforms that are going to provide enormous amounts of information. And so the kinds of things that were happening in 714, you can just see the line of trajectory up to Maven and where Maven is going.
One of our listeners asks the question with a statement, to fight a network, you need a network. This, of course, is famously General McChrystal's. How did that operate? How did it manifest itself?
Yeah, well, I'd like to say that, with a bit of humility, I added something to that. So it takes a network that's able to operate inside another network, right, and to knock that other network down from the inside out. And so the way that worked was that the JSOU, in effect, was this sort of extremely big intelligence system or network. And the process of taking advantage of all of that data was it started to show you could start to build a network of, let's say, Al-Qaeda in the northwest section of Mosul. And you start to see, you're starting to frame this out. This was the analysis component of F3EA. And now by doing that, and of course having all of this intelligence that you can use certain tools to look for connections, you can begin to see who's important in that network. Which are the the important elements, you can start to collect on that. You know, you may put a full motion video feed on top of that particular area. You can start to listen. And so that's what I think that I know that's what it meant when it said what General McChrystal meant when he said takes a network to defeat a network, and you defeat it by getting inside it, seeing what's what, and starting to tear it down from the inside out.
Another one of our colleagues asks the following. While the tactical success of 714 and F3 EAD is undeniable, given where the strategic situation stands today in Iraq and Afghanistan, do you believe we have focused too much on doing things right versus doing the right things to facilitate long-term strategic success?
Well, I mean, that's
op-ed piece.
Yeah, I mean, that's that 714, along with the counterinsurgency program that is supported in Iraq, got us to the position where I would argue we had success at the operational level, and now it was up to others to take advantage of that and turn that into strategic success, which has to do with things that 714 and military forces only have a little bit to contribute to. But that meant staying the course. Now, I hate to plug myself, but I wrote about this in PRISM, which is not prison, PRISM.
PRISM.
Yeah, which is the publication of the National War College, and looked at, you know, how we squandered what we had achieved, but those were political decisions.
Exactly. Let me ask another question, and you and I have discussed this previously, and that is this seeming scarcity of analysts, given the amount of data that we are dealing with, and how that's going to affect the shape of our intelligence capabilities in the future.
Yeah, well, I tried to, I tried to get at this in terms of how again, I mean, I feel I'm shameless here. I'm going to talk about my book, but I have a chapter in there on the theme of the book was how does intelligence have to change when the following conditions occur. You go from peacetime to wartime. You go from spending all of your time focusing on state targets to non-state targets. And you're focusing on non-state targets that you've never seen before. Yeah. So how does intelligence have to change? And in the case of, I have a whole chapter on analysis, and in the case of analysis, it means that we need a new type of analyst that is going to be able to work with new kinds of data. And you know, if we think about analysts in the past, they were dealing with scraps of data from various sources, human, you know, overhead, so on, that they would weave together. Now, they're dealing with massive amounts of data, and they may be looking for things. I'm thinking especially about the problem that commanders are going to face. You know, they're going to be looking for things that are concealed, that are dispersed, and there's going to be a tremendous amount of collection signals, an array of type of imagery, you know, the kind of really technical things that signatures collection give you. And so analysts are going to have to be trained for these new situations, and it's already happening. I mean, you know, Soft's ahead of the game here. If you go, you know, down to Fort Bragg, you can see that. But that, I think, is a sea change for analysis, and it's actually an argument that's been made going back to at least the end of the 2000s. I mean, former heads of some of our intelligence agencies were making that argument.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have a question. Given your perspective on this context and placing it within a Clausewitzian paradigm, what would you say the centers of gravity are in this irregular warfare, this hybrid warfare that we are talking about and that we are facing today?
Well, I mean, if we think about the non-state actor and groups like ISIS, groups like Al Qaeda, ISIS, and so on, you know, what's their center of gravity? It's their networks, and it's their ability to communicate and to use modern communication platforms to build their organization. Now, it's amazing to think, you know, how many ISIS fighters were recruited from afar and brought to Syria. So, you know, their center, you know, when you think about centers of gravity, yes, it's their networks, but one of the lessons that I drew from, you know, looking at ISIS was they had a way of spotting, assessing, evaluating, and recruiting that was awesome. And, you know, no one knows exactly how many foreign fighters they brought, but somewhere it's over 30,000.
Yes.
No one did. What other armed group has ever done that? You know, that in terms of foreign recruitment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have a question from within JSOU asking, how do you believe that we in JSOU might influence the educational mindset of the NonSoft intelligence community to be better aligned with the concept that you're addressing?
Yeah, well, I don't know enough about inside JSOU to be able to answer that, but I think it needs answering. And I do think that, you know, it's really important for SOF and the command to be able to show what pathfinders they are. You know, and I remember I made this argument back in the 90s to General Downing. You know, General Downing actually was General Terry Scott first, and I was down at Fort Bragg helping with something, and I had dinner with General Scott, and he said to me, he said, you know, now that the Cold War is over, what in our history should we be looking at? And I said to him, Jack, Mac VSOG. And, yeah, and he said, well, why Mac VSOG? And I said, well, you know, it was by far the biggest and most complex paramilitary operation, I thought, of the Cold War. And while we may never do another Mac VSOG, there are lots of things that Mac VSOG did, I think, that we need to learn from and make people aware of that. And so I convinced him to open the SOG archives, and, you know, that turned into the secret war against Hanoi, which I wrote at the end of the 90s. And I think that, and this was the argument for the monograph. Without giving away, you know, the details, there's a lot to learn by others from what SOFT does. And but you know, you have to, someone has to articulate that, you know, and that's what I try to do in the monograph. And that's the whole purpose of big data at war, to show SOF as a pathfinder.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we have a question focusing on the National Defense Strategy, Irregular Warfare Annex, and it states that IW is not only a SOF function, but also the function of the Joint Force. How does the intel community transform to support the Joint Force conducting IW? You've said that we are in fact making headway in the SOF community along this path. In particular, intelligence to support non-kinetic actions to get at human aspects and non-traditional ordnance on a target.
Yeah, that's a complicated question. There are things that
Dick, is it complicated or is it complex?
It's complex.
Yes.
Yeah, good. And I'm not sure, you know, how to answer all of it. But SOF, there are things SOF is doing that are non-kinetic, but can be coercive, and that is especially in the area of information and information operations, and those are things that I think have support for the Joint Force. Now, I don't want to go into too much of the detail of that, but that's definitely fact.
Mm-hmm. I've been interested in your comments in both the monograph and the book about as the organization of 714 changed, how they went about getting the players in the three-letter organizations to come into the fold and to play on be on the same playing field, where everybody was together for one mission. Not that they wouldn't do that, but that this is something they faced. Comments on that? Yeah,
that is where, you know, the big personalities really were important, and where, you know, General McChrystal was really important, and then later Admiral McRaven, and that is, you know, it's like everyone operates on their interest, you know, and it seems like everyone, even though we think everyone should be mission oriented, you know, everyone asks the age-old question, what's in it for me? And what Task Force 714 was able to show is that there was a lot in it for the other intelligence agencies, because they were gaining access to information that wasn't just about Iraq. You know, it was about Al-Qaeda and its affiliates globally, and so, you know, this is what's in it for you, and then, you know, you can contribute to it. So that I think was really important, and, you know, making the argument that, you know, this is the center of gravity in the fight against extremism. Iraq is the center of gravity. And so those were the kinds of arguments that you made to convince the three-letter agencies, as Admiral McChrystal called them, to convince the three-letter agencies to play ball. But I don't see that as, I mean, that's kind of normal.
Absolutely. And they probably already had some experience with a JIADF-like organization with Southern Command, so this was not new.
This was not new. And ironically, it was like one of these best kept secrets, though, this idea of JIADF. And I remember Admiral McRaven and General McChrystal talking about it when Admiral McRaven called it, said, we needed a JIADF. Well, what's that? So he writes it on the board, and then you got to start to deconstruct it. What is this JIADF?
Absolutely, absolutely. Could you also talk just a bit about the issues as we approach this with acquisition and our ability to acquire the kinds of technology we will need to pull all this together and to parse out all of this information, what that's going to take?
Yeah, this is a really interesting part of what I've stumbled on in doing the research on Maven, and that is that the acquisition process is different. In the past, acquisition has been about fielding hardware, fielding a plane or fielding a tank or whatever. And the way that a whole defense industry infrastructure was built around that. So, we have defense industries whose origins are traced to Pentagon needs, and they create through acquisition they built these defense firms, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, etc. And now today, the big acquisition need is going to be software, and that's a very different acquisition process with a very different set of companies who produce software, and so this is changing the acquisition process. So, for example, you don't field something in the old way until you're absolutely certain it's good to go. But in dealing with something like computer vision, which was an important capability that Maven wanted to field for full motion video, you field it in its early iteration. So this is all different, and you've got to, you don't have a defense industry infrastructure. There's this place called Silicon Valley, but that's not you haven't been operating in that AO in the same way that you have with Northrop Grumman and so on. So this is an interesting aspect of it that I'm just learning about. But the acquisition process is changing. There's this book that I just started to read. What's it called? Kill Chain, which talks about some of this. Very interesting. It's by McCain's former staff director.
I would also ask, in terms of organizational change and size, 714 for example, would not be as large as the planning capability in Afghanistan at the IGC level, the 3-star level. And yet there were attempts very early on following the 714 model to try to compress the planning cycle to bring more agency to what was going on and to come up with more actionable intelligence quicker, the planning quicker. Do large organizations, in your view, are they able to do this like a smaller organization will? Or is the nimbleness of a small organization really an asset in this discussion?
Well, I think in this case, I mean, it was an asset, and it was an organization with a culture. And the culture lent itself to this kind of adaptation. One of the things that in trying to figure out what are the characteristics of a learning organization, one of the things that I came across in the business and management literature was this idea that you're not paralyzed when things go wrong. You know, it doesn't paralyze you. Where, if we think about, I mean, maybe this is a bit unfair, but if we think about, the army in Iraq, it took the army in Iraq to 2007 to change, and in the case, big organizations tend to be paralyzed by surprise, and they just keep doing the same thing. And the story in Iraq was doing the same thing was contributing to you losing the war. So where a small organization, I think, tends to be more flexible. I think the thing about 714 that made this really so was the culture of the culture that goes along with it. So they weren't paralyzed. At first they were a little bit, because McChrystal said, yeah, our first reaction was to double down. High-speed organization, we're just going to double down. That wasn't going to do it. Doubling down wouldn't do it. But understanding adaptation, that was going to do it. They knew they had to adapt. They just had to find out what that adaptation was going to look like, and how they were going to figure that out.
As we begin to finish up here, let me ask you a kind of open-ended question. What 2 or 3 things do you think listeners should take away from this conversation that could be useful for them and useful for understanding what happened in the past and what we ought to be doing now and then for the future?
Yeah, so I think that there are a lot of lessons from 714 about adaptation and innovation that can be generalized, about flexibility. So that's sort of one big set of factors. I think the other big thing that I would hope we can take away from this, and that is that we are in the midst of big change, and that big change has to do with this whole cyber arena and artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, how we manage this data, how we take advantage of it. and how it can empower commanders. And to think about, commands in the future, we talk about mission command, but I think that we need to be thinking about and talking about AI-enabled mission commands, and what that is going to look like and how we take advantage of that, and that is something that all of our commands, not just our special operations command, has to be thinking about. That's kind of what's on my mind these days.
Yes, that command operating picture is going to be quite complex.
It's quite complex. We already have, one of the interesting things, again, about SOF is that they're first to have new systems that allow you to combine common operating picture, common intelligence picture, overhead feeds, AI unit that's attached to it. All of that is happening, and I think that's where we're headed in terms of command and how that makes the decision-making process for the commander, so rapid, so fast.
Well, this has been marvelous, and we do appreciate you taking the time to come and speak with us today. I know I found it very interesting, and I do ask everybody, take a look at the monograph, please. Look at the book, and you will enjoy every bit of it. So thank you again. Thank you very much. For feedback on this session or any Think JSOU activity, please contact us at thinkjsou@socom.mil. I'd like to close by once again encouraging everyone to explore the complete Think JSOU collection by subscribing through the library or on one of the social media channels on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, or APAN. Additionally, the US SOCOM library is an exceptional resource for checking out electronic books or to download past and present JSOU monographs through the JSOU Press. You can always check out upcoming courses and events on our website, which is www.socom.mil/JSOU. This series is brought to you by the Department of Strategic Studies of the Joint Special Operations University, and we thank all of you for watching. Dick, thank you.
Thank you, Jack.
Very much.